Welcome to Conversations with Epiphany. Let's Talk, the show where we dive deep into the essence of what makes our guests uniquely themselves. Join as we uncover the stories, experiences, and moments that shape their lives. From the triumphs to the trials, we're here to explore it all. Let's get talking and discover the heart of every story.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. Welcome back into another Conversations with Epiphany. I am so happy to be here with Tyriek White, who is the author of We Are a Hunting. I'm so glad you joined me today, Tyriek.
Thank you for the invite. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
So excited to have this conversation,
Right. Yes.
Very happy that you reached out and chose
Yes.
and gave the book your time and effort and all that. So I really appreciate that.
Yes, no problem. No problem. So first of all, what inspired you to start the book? Was it like character memory, or was it like something else entirely?
That's a there's like a few parts to that. I think initially I set out to kind of just write this coming of age story about a young person growing up
Mhm.
in a similar community as mine,
Mhm.
which is this working class black and brown community in Brooklyn.
Mhm.
Um, it was to really kind of just like write about that experience, growing up in that experience, having a family and trying to, just survive the day to day,
Mhm.
and really try to capture my full, sort of human experience in that. Um, and I think as I, you know, finished or built the book and worked toward finishing it, it sort of changed. It changed a lot. My reasoning, my interest, my I guess what I wanted the book to do.
Mhm.
I realized it was capable of so much more, especially um, just having a mentor coming down here to Mississippi,
Mhm.
from New York,
Mhm.
and having just a clear kind of view of sort of the lineage of like how even sort of my family ended up in New York,
Mhm.
the Great Migration, how many folk, you know, how many of us come from the South,
Right.
and still live
Mhm.
and fight and all of these things and love in the South.
Right.
Um, so I think at a certain point it became about placing this community, and focusing on this family as well, but also where does this community sit in the context of um, Black life in America,
Mhm.
inner cities that connect, that relate, that though we have our small cultural sort of differences or the styles in which we speak,
Right.
there's so many there's so much that connects us. There's so much that binds us. I just wanted to kind of highlight
Mhm.
um, those things.
Right. Yeah,
Right?
that's yeah, no, that's good. And like you said, it was like the Great Migration. Like my grandmother, she was from Georgia, but when she
Mm,
was like 1920, she moved to New York. So,
mm,
that's where it just all just unfolded from there. And I
right.
think that happens a lot, like you said, amongst, African Americans,
Hmm.
and things like that. So, your novel is nonlinear. So how did that happen? Like, was that like your purpose of doing that, or like how did you decide to like each generation you wanted to hear do their voice in from their own perspective?
Hmm. Um, it's so interesting, like what kind of starts out as your intent, and like
Mhm.
what happens during the process of like creating a thing, a art project or whatever,
Mhm.
or like a piece of yourself.
Mhm.
Um, it grew and expanded.
Mhm.
Initially, I thought about I guess the ways in which we kind of think about the living and the dead. I
Mm,
think that like interested me in the beginning,
right.
um, and that grew to kind of talking about this theory of being socially dead, which is this theory by um,
Mm,
this Caribbean um, sort of philosopher,
mhm,
and it kind of talks about like that in our citizenship, like
mhm,
as or the ways we're shut out from
mhm.
um, we're shut out from voting. Shut out
Right.
a lot of the kind of, I guess when you think about the creation of like the suburbs,
Mhm.
suburban houses,
Right.
um, you know, the white folks got grants to
Right. Mhm. That's true. Yeah.
communities or whatever, and
Right.
while we were sort of kind of left.
Mhm.
Especially with the industrialization and like jobs leaving and stuff like that, we were sort of left.
Right.
Um, and I think like figuring out what it means to be alive and living for
Right.
Black folk,
Right.
especially Juneteenth, we celebrate
Exactly.
sort of all that we've kind of come from, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Exactly.
and just kind of having that in us of like that constant existential discussion of like
Right.
you know what does it mean to raise a family? What does it mean to kind of survive in this country of
Right.
oppression?
Mhm.
And just kind of thinking about new ways of imagining. Um, like this book was a chance for me to kind of like write my own folktale in a sense.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and I kind of take on this project of what are the stories we want to tell about ourselves.
Right.
Um,
Mhm.
That's what some of my favorite authors did, Toni
Right.
Morrison, James
Mhm.
Baldwin.
Yeah.
Um, so just kind of um, looking to new ways of
Mhm.
not just surviving,
Right.
but also thriving, but also like dealing with
Mhm.
the loss, right?
Mhm.
And that's what this country kind of has this inability to do is like look
Mhm.
at itself, look at its past, and
Right.
move forward in healthy, productive ways. But
Exactly.
um, yeah, sorry. I feel like I
Like,
was
you're fine. No. And I know the characters like you like Coley, like your ability to write about a black boy who's dealing with grief
mm,
and coming of age.
mm,
um how how did that resonate with you, like that story of him dealing with all those things? Because I know coming of age and dealing with grief, those can be very, that could be a very trying time. So how did you create that character in such a beautiful way, that a lot of young men could relate to that?
mm. Well, thank you for that. Because I do love that character a
Mm-hmm.
lot. There's definitely pieces of kind of my own upbringing
Hmm.
in him,
Hmm.
and I think kind of describing um, you know like this black boy who is a bit rambunctious, but
Hmm.
um, is also a thinker, also kind of sits with himself alone a lot,
Yeah.
who kind of attempts to
Hmm.
as best as he could sort of
Right.
deal with
Hmm.
um, everything that's been given to him and
Right.
make sense of the world around him,
Hmm.
um, which like I think is such an incredible project because sometimes you don't get to see that. You get to see one
Hmm.
side of black men or like a version of black men,
Right.
um, that can be good and can work for others.
Right.
Um, but I just wanted to capture like a different, um, and not even if he differs greatly from his friends or like he
Right.
is an outcast or anything like that. It's just you know showing, maybe a quieter
Right.
side of, or someone who is sensitive, or going through the motions of exploring like how he feels about things.
That's
um I think that was really, for me at least,
mm-hmm.
um the purpose of like writing him in this kind of coming of age
Right.
situation, to kind of like show these different dimensions,
Right.
in that, growing up working class, and
Mm-hmm.
like cursing and drinking on the
Mm-hmm.
train, and outside on the stoops, like
Right.
that's still, a part of his, the lumps you take when you're
Mm-hmm.
growing up, or
Right.
the incredible times you have with the people around you,
Exactly.
but also painting, this inner life of this young kid.
Right.
um thought that was like
Yeah.
super
Yeah.
important.
Definitely, definitely important. Like you said, to show different elements of Black men. I think that's important in
Hmm.
media. Very important. So, Audrey and Key, they carry their own burdens and, like, I guess, say, forms of resistance.
Mm.
How do you see
Mm.
motherhood functioning in this novel? And I guess, yeah, the
Ooh,
matriarch, I guess you could say. Yeah.
it's a big part.
Right.
It's a huge part.
Hmm.
um this story kind of, oh, excuse me, sort
Hmm.
of started off, again, like I said earlier, with just kind of Kali.
Right.
And as it grew and as it built, um these other voices started coming,
Right.
um
Hmm.
or bringing, certain pieces to the story that, I wasn't focusing on initially, right?
Right.
um Key popped up on me like
Mhm.
out of the blue, just
Right.
in thinking about the story, but thinking about other, time
Mhm.
periods in the story, right? Like
Right.
I just wanted to, well, I wanted to write about, the late 80s, early 90s. um and it started as like this short, kind of very short story.
Right.
um and it's funny, that's where a lot of the book kind of changes its shape, because she brought, um sort of this ability to see ghosts,
Mm.
um
Right.
and this connection to her mom kind of
Mhm.
brings this, like you said, the maternal,
Right.
it positions the family as this matriarchal kind of family structure. So,
Right.
you see Kali in his mourning,
Mhm.
is also a yearning to, know more about his mom, but
Mhm.
also, you see how much he loves his mom, how much he respects and thinks she's, this force,
Right.
um, which which is, I think, a lot of the times,
Mhm.
especially, if you were raised,
Mhm.
by a single mom,
Mhm.
or, if your family split and, you spend more time with your mom, um,
Right.
that's it's a different sort of connection.
Mm.
And
Definitely.
I loved exploring that, right? And
Mhm.
debunking myths, and, just kind of, speaking to that relationship. Um,
Right.
but motherhood, becomes like this
Mhm.
vital, thing, because Key's whole mission and her project in the story becomes centered around, um, her ability to
Right.
to not only, forge this connection with her son
Mhm.
in the living, right,
Right.
but that connection continues even
Mhm.
when she passes.
Mhm.
I hope that's not a spoiler, but
Right. Yes. No, I totally understand that. And
Mhm.
a question that I get asked, like, with writing, they always ask, so is this inspired by something personal, like for you? Like,
Mm.
and I always say, like, because I write like romance and things like that. So I'm like, no,
Mhm.
I'm a people watcher. Like, when I write, I'm
Yeah,
a people
same.
watcher, and I'm like, yeah, yeah. And I'm like, okay, well, why did this person do this?
Right.
So with your novel, does that is that a part of, like, your life, you would say, growing up, or did you take pieces of your life and then you integrated that into this novel?
Yeah, yeah. It's it's a good amount of
Mhm.
kind of just the experience, right? Um, Obviously, like I didn't, I was born in the early '90s.
Right.
So I wasn't born in the '80s though.
Right.
So I
Mhm.
didn't really have much,
Right.
except like like the old music.
Right.
Um, my brothers and
Mhm.
cousins used to listen to. So I had to
Right.
do, I had to do like real
Mhm.
kind of research.
Right.
Um, but I think what makes the book work, you know,
Right.
um, what kind of grounds it in a sense from being like, you know, this kind of ghost story, uh,
Mhm.
is that it is grounded in sort of these real experiences. It
Right.
feels tangible.
Right.
Um, there's a texture to it, and I think
Mhm.
that comes from yeah, me growing up in a community similar and kind
Mhm.
of pouring that part of myself into the book.
Right.
Um, Also, though, just as a creative, learning how to use these very real moments
Mhm.
in your life or the lives of others,
Right.
um, and sort of using that to kind of fuel, um, certain scenes, certain ideas, certain thoughts. Around the time uh, when well, a couple years, but
Mhm.
when the initial kind of idea for this
Mhm.
book came to be,
Right.
my grandmother had passed,
Mhm.
and I dealt with this whole sort of mourning period,
Mhm.
because I love my grandmother, of course. It's, elders,
Mhm.
we, kind of that, you feel like you're losing stories almost, right? Like you're losing a
Right.
part of yourself, a part of your history that,
Mhm.
you can't really access anymore, right?
Right.
And but also seeing like my mom, how she
Right.
dealt with,
Mhm.
she had lost her mom, you know,
Right. Right.
um, and that like whole sort of experience kind of, you know,
Right.
did a
Mhm.
lot in terms of
Mhm.
like how she was with me, how she was with her sister or
Right.
brother, like just seeing the way a family reacts,
Mhm.
especially with such a a heavy loss, a
Right.
consuming loss.
Yeah.
Um, so even those kind of watching those breakdowns and like how the family sort of
Mhm.
you know you need to fill this space in a sense,
Right.
right? You need to like, so who fills that space, or like what do you do and what do I do that um can supplement what our
Right.
grandmother, our mom left
Right.
behind.
Right.
How do we carry the family
Mhm.
forward? So just all those questions pretty much informed a lot of like how
Right.
grief gets talked about in this book.
Right. And it's something that you say that about like when an elder passes away, it feels like there's the story is kind of like, okay, so who's, now.
Mm,
And my grandmother, my mom's mother,
mm,
she passed away when I was 7. And my
mm,
mom, she was 38. And
mm,
so like now, like, 7, I'm 28 now. So, I remember, try to remember her as, woman of faith. And
mm,
now, like you said, with the untelling of the story now, like on my grandfather's side, just trying to unpack that story, like, his father, just trying to
mhm.
get the stories of, I wish I would have asked when I was like, my grandfather, he passed when I was 17. So I was like, the
Yeah,
stories that I wish I would have asked him about
right.
when I was, because he went to, this, he went to a military school in Virginia, one of the like the
Mm,
only black one, for
wow.
and so like all those things, I wish I would have asked him, but
And we be young. We don't know that,
we do.
time is precious, and
Right,
but
right.
I feel you.
Right. And like I said, that's why like I'm trying like, well, practicing to like tell the story, in a way that I
Mm.
can without actually like hearing, what he said, about it himself. So,
Right.
and I know dreams and rituals play a big part in your novel. Um, how big of a part was spirituality with creating your characters?
How big was spirituality
Mhm.
in my life,
In creating your characters?
or just in creating
Yeah.
um very much.
Mhm.
I think I mean I had agendas,
Mhm.
but I think I just wanted to explore other
Mhm.
kind of spiritual practices as well. You know,
Right.
of course there's the church, and you
Mhm.
know, especially black folk, the
Right.
church is, more than this place of worship, is actually pretty much a community center, right? Or,
Right.
you
Yeah.
know, this place where a lot of kind of the politics of
Mhm.
a community can get shaped.
Right.
So that's like forever present. But also contrasting that with kind of these spiritual practices that um, sort of have moved with us
Right.
throughout, you know, history, throughout
Mhm.
the colonial process of
Right.
white folk bringing us here.
Mhm.
Um, there's a lot that we've kept in ways, right?
Right. Mhm.
So like hoodoo, there's elements of hoodoo, um, which comes from
Mhm.
Black Americans in the South.
Right.
Some of those kind of um, I guess rituals and
Mhm.
practices. There's also a lot of kind of West African
Mhm.
mythology, or spiritual, religious elements.
Mhm.
Also
Right.
the Caribbean and Haiti,
Mhm.
Voodoo
Mhm.
gets mentioned in the book, but
Right.
um, all of this kind of, I just first off, I'm so interested in it,
Mhm.
just because of, again, like writing our mythology,
Right.
thinking about how we tell stories about ourselves.
Mhm.
Um, I found it so, you know,
Right.
interesting that you could kind of trace
Mhm.
um, this kind of religious experience and practice kind of
Right.
across oceans, right, and
Mhm.
across time and history, um, to the point where people still believe in these
Mhm.
things to this day.
Right.
Like I mean, I've had you know maybe great aunts,
Mhm.
great uncles, or great aunts, kind of hit me with a parable from like a hoodoo tale or whatever, but
Mhm.
you wouldn't even know it. It's just
Right.
kind of embedded or ingrained
Mhm.
in us.
Right.
Um, so I found just having all of these things in conversation with one another,
Mhm.
um, to be super important,
Right.
mainly because I believe that spirituality, not necessarily the kind of, and let me,
Right.
maybe not necessarily like
Mhm.
the organizational structure
Right.
surroundings,
Mhm.
some religions,
Right.
um, but the kind of belief, faith,
Mhm. Right.
um, the ways we come together. I think
Mhm.
those are like super important for us,
Right. Mhm.
as people, but especially as Black folk.
Yes, it's definitely like building that community. Like I
Right.
said, based on faith. It's very, you're right. It's very, very important. Exactly. And I know throughout the book, you explore gentrification, um, and you also put a through spiritual lenses as well, through historical trauma. And
Mm.
what do you hope readers take away that um, from that lens?
Mm. I mean, I would just hope that people think, people recognize. I don't even want to say who the enemy is, but like
Mhm.
that people
Mhm.
recognize
Mhm.
that we're fighting against, white supremacy. We're fighting against capitalism.
Right.
We are not fighting each other. Um,
Right. Mhm.
so, you
Right.
know, I think a lot of it comes, is especially relevant now,
Mhm.
But I don't know if I was in this particular place when I wrote it.
Right.
But especially now,
Mhm. Right.
seeing our struggle as like as very much our own, as very much a Black American struggle, but it
Mhm.
is also connected to a global struggle,
Right.
and kind of, you know, um, and thinking about us as a diaspora, uh,
Right. Mhm.
as Black folk in Africa, as Black folk in the
Mhm.
Caribbean, as Black
Mhm.
folk in South America.
Right.
There's so much commonalities
Right.
in kind of the subjugation that we experience in these countries,
Mhm.
that I think overshadows sometimes maybe our differences. Um,
Right. Mhm. Mhm.
so I the reason I kind of trace a lot of stuff, a lot of elements,
Mhm.
kind of back to the Caribbean or back to Africa,
Right.
is because that through line,
Mhm.
um, to me, is more than like a organizing principle. It's
Mhm.
I find
Mhm.
such deep like pride,
Mhm.
um, like and you probably felt this
Mhm.
as a Black person, just like on the verge of tears of like
Right.
how much our
Right.
people have dealt with and overcome,
Mhm.
right?
Right. Exactly.
And I think that starts, you know,
Right.
I mean, of course, slavery, but I think that starts even further back.
Mhm.
We start to
Mhm.
reclaim
Right.
certain pieces that
Right.
were left behind, or
Right.
were brutally killed. Like
Right. Exactly.
there's pieces that we can
Mhm.
keep, um, in terms of thinking about ourselves and our connection to other people.
Right.
Um,
That's true. Yeah, definitely. And like you said, during Juneteenth, it's kind of like, I go back in time and I just think, I'm like, wow, my ancestors, and you just think about all that they've been through and all that they,
mhm,
endured in order for each generation to just get better and better and better and better and
right,
better.
right.
Yes. So, I think that's
And I
important.
think we get sometimes, not to
Mhm.
cut you off, but
No,
like
you're fine.
sometimes we get like sort of down on ourselves, or like
Mhm.
sometimes we lose hope and faith.
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
but I think understanding that our ancestors had the understanding of like,
Right.
I won't be the one to do it, or I won't be the one to see
Mhm.
a certain freedom or a certain liberation,
Yeah.
but hopefully my child can, or hopefully they can pass it down to their, so
Exactly.
just even understanding this path as a person, as a
Right.
revolutionary, as a
Mhm.
bystander, as someone who just wants to make it right. I
Right.
think having that, like, okay, passing this along, like I'm
Right.
just doing a piece of the work. I can
Right.
only do a piece of the work.
Right.
um and just
That's
keeping that going.
right. Right. And that's a good way to look at it. Only like piece of the work. And that's, and before you know it, it's like it just builds upon each other. So
Mhm.
June is Men's Mental Health Month. And I know in your book
Mm.
that you with Coley, mental health, and the way it's portrayed. Why was that so important for you to portray his emotional struggles?
Mm. um I thought it was important because, well, one, like I, kind of alluded to earlier, is,
Mhm.
we hardly see,
Right.
um, that of, you know, a young Black kid who's,
Right.
a bit sensitive,
Right.
um, who's into art, and,
Right.
all of these things, while also being into, more traditional things. I thought that was important too, like not to just make it like, the different kid is
Right.
the one who makes it out, or whatever, or
Right.
whatever's implied there, because
Right.
I think that's random, right? I
Mhm.
think who
Right.
who
Yeah.
makes it out
Mhm.
is luck. It's a
Mhm.
whole bunch of other stuff that has nothing to do with
Mhm.
anything,
Right.
um like character based. um
Right.
but I did want to show this kind of multifaceted,
Mhm.
young person,
Right.
because especially trying to deal with something, right? To like
Right.
the wave of of
Right.
sadness from whatever you're going through. I
Mhm.
think was so powerful about Kali's story is that
Mhm.
you see the attempts, right? You see him
Mhm.
attempting to find things that
Right.
kind of work for him, that kind of get him to
Mhm.
not get lost in his
Right.
grief, right?
Right.
To not I can't think of the word, but to not succumb to
Mhm.
what can happen. I mean, because a lot of our young our young men, you know,
Right.
a lot of the show or the front of it, the veneer of
Mhm.
it is to hide, these very similar kind of feelings of depression or,
Right. Mhm.
absence of self-worth,
Right.
of
Mhm.
kind of aimlessness, or like trying to figure out, how do I provide, right?
Right. Right.
As a
Right.
man.
Right.
So um I thought like kind of talking through some of that and like,
Mhm.
showing like a young kid actually, okay, what does he get into? What is he
Right.
how does he sort of try to, you know, kind of piece together his life again after the loss of his mom? And a
Right.
lot of that involves kind of, figuring out what art means to him, what it does for him,
Right.
in terms of processing the world,
Exactly.
processing his grief,
Mhm.
but also, finding pieces of his mom, right? That
Right.
kind of reclaiming again, of things he might not have known about her while
Right.
she was alive. Because parents don't want to tell you everything, like
Right.
especially when you're young, right?
Right. That's true.
Um, so him like kind of just like finding out
Mhm.
things from her friends, from uh, his dad.
Right.
Um, you know, it kind of I love that process of him sort of
Right.
doing this like kind of reconnaissance work of like, okay, I
Right.
want to know her even
Mhm.
more right
Right.
now.
Right. Reading We Are All Haunting, you can get all the feels like revolutionary, and things like that. So do you think, well, when you wrote the book, did you want it to be, because of course when you write, you want to tell a great story. And as times have gone on, did you think that it would, well, a political novel, would you put it in that category? Especially with things that are unfolding in today's world, how would you classify it?
Mm, that's a good word. Um, I think I would
Mhm.
just less, you know, less about plot and what it's about,
Right.
and more so in that a number of things. One,
Right.
it sort of seeks to redefine,
Mhm.
um, and I think
Yeah.
that's kind of up there with representation, right? Seeing
Right.
yourself reflected in what you're reading, what you're seeing.
Right.
Um, but I wanted to always, I had this
Mhm.
this kind of notion
Mhm.
of, all right, what if I uplift
Mhm.
the things I grew up on, right? That I
Mhm.
cherish, the mixtapes my brother
Mhm.
used to play,
Mhm.
when we were growing up, uh,
Right.
the samples
Mhm.
my dad would flick through in
Mhm.
his vinyl collection,
Right.
um, the the stories my mom would tell me when I was
Mhm.
growing up.
Right.
Um, all of these things
Mhm.
become a part of you, right? They
Mhm.
stay with you,
They did.
and then you know you go through life. You go to a predominantly white institution, right, for
Mhm.
college. Uh,
Mhm.
after spending your whole life in public school,
Mhm.
you learn literature with the capital L,
Mhm.
the bunch of
Yeah.
white dudes.
Right.
Um, you live and breathe and
Mhm.
sort of learn in various white spaces,
Mhm.
um, that this is important, that this
Mhm.
certain thing is important,
Right.
um, and you try to embrace that while also
Mhm.
holding on to the things that you grew up with. That
Right.
no, those things are also important. Those
It's
things are also brilliant and
mhm.
genius, and, you know.
Right.
Um, so I always moved kind of, you know, through
Mm.
life in a way,
Right.
with that, right?
Mhm.
So when it came time to kind of write this book, um,
Right.
it was all about sort of, when you talk about,
Mhm.
whatever, Chaucer or
Mhm.
Shakespeare, or
Mhm.
these things, but also bringing, having it up here, but also bringing up, you know, the DMXs, the
Right. Mhm.
Outcasts,
Mhm.
just,
Right. Exactly.
and just beyond music, just the
Right.
sensibilities, right?
Right.
There's a lot of art in this
Right.
book, like
Yes.
traditional art,
Exactly.
and having those kind of
Mhm.
discussions, right? There's this part where I talk about like how there was a project after the Cold War
Right.
to get artists to leave, or to not create art that was like socially
Mhm.
aware or responsible. It was
Right.
it was more so about the aesthetics. It was more
Mhm.
so like,
Mhm.
oh,
Right.
like
Mhm. Right.
abstract expressionism. Exactly.
Mhm.
It's the exact kind of art form that,
Right.
and this is all
Mhm.
recorded, like
Mhm.
even MFA programs, right? Were kind
Mhm.
of,
Mhm.
you know, it's
Right.
it was essentially like, I don't wanna get shut down, but the CPA was essentially like,
Right.
we want you to highlight the
Mhm.
aesthetic
Right.
sensibilities of literature. We don't want protest novels and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so even the book in itself, when it
Right.
talks about this, is rejecting this, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
so I think in just kind of like writing the thing that I wanted to
Mhm.
write,
Right.
I inherently created this ghost story, this
Mhm.
family kind of saga or whatever,
Mhm.
but at, you know, the core of it too, this kind of political
Right.
novel in a way. Um,
Right.
and I think it starts with intent, right?
Right. Mhm.
Um,
Exactly.
I wanted to tell a story. I wanted to
Mhm.
just, write a story that moved people,
Right.
that you can relate to the characters. But I think in intent, right, the
Mhm.
way, not only the way you move about life, but also like what do you want to pour into your art, or like what do you want people to get from this thing that you're
Right.
giving them.
Mhm.
I think intent is at the heart of it.
Yeah.
So I didn't intend for it to be a political novel, but
Mhm.
inherently it's just
Right.
these
Yeah.
elements are going to be
Right.
present.
Definitely. Yeah, it's definitely, and I can definitely like sense those elements throughout the book. So that's really good. I know you mentioned, 20
Sorry,
20.
the volume is kind of low. Hold on, give me a second.
Mhm.
Okay, sorry, it's me.
Okay, you good? Okay.
My bad.
No, you're fine. No, you're fine. I know you mentioned like writers like Toni Morrison and things like that. So,
Mhm.
what are the writers or the thinkers who gave, I guess, this worldview of storytelling, especially around Blackness, place, and legacy?
So what authors
Hmm. That
I
inspired
like?
you. Hmm.
Ooh, I mean, there's a good amount. Uh, Toni Morrison,
Hmm.
Gloria Naylor. I don't
Hmm.
know if she wrote this book called Mama Day,
Mm.
which is kind of like, yeah, if you read Mama Day, you'll see,
Mhm. Yeah.
you'll see, uh, you'll see where We Are a Haunting comes
Hmm.
from. But
Hmm.
Kiese Layman,
Hmm.
he's a really one of the best writers we have. He's from Mississippi.
Mhm.
He's actually one of the reasons I came down here for, sort of the opportunity to work with him.
Right.
He has this book called Heavy, which is
Mhm.
a memoir. Um, I recommend everybody
Mhm.
um, should check him out.
Right.
Um, I'm a huge Amani Perry
Mhm.
fan. Um, she's incredible. I've been reading her since Prophets of the Hood, which
Mhm.
she wrote
Mhm.
this collection of essays about hip hop.
Mhm.
And obviously she's gone on to like you know create you know these holistic
Mhm.
portraits of America
Right.
and ourselves in that, thinking about black folk in that as well.
Right.
Disha Phil, y'all,
Mhm.
so dope. She's and these are current writers. You can
Right. Mhm.
I suggest people don't walk, run
Mhm. Right.
to check these folk out. Um,
Mhm.
of course, Nana Kwame Abrenia, like
Mhm.
Chain Gang All Stars is
Mhm.
you know fire.
Mhm.
Sadiq Fafana, he
Mhm.
wrote this book, stories of the tenements
Mhm.
downstairs, I think. Oh damn. You could look it up, but
Right.
it's a really it's a really dope story.
Right.
Um, he tells like each it's a collection of stories, but each story is
Mhm.
like an apartment in this
Right.
apartment building.
Mhm.
Very, very cool. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, there's I mean, there's always, the classics like Audre
Mhm.
Lorde. I'm a
Mhm.
big poetry
Mhm.
head, so like,
Right.
June Jordan. Uh,
Mhm.
uh, but yeah, like
Mhm.
current day, I'd go with those.
Right.
Oh, Jesmyn Ward. Jesmyn Ward
Mhm.
is like, one of my favorite
Mhm.
writers. Um, yeah, there's so many. There's
Right.
so
Right.
many.
I know you named a few. I was like, oh, I definitely gotta go on my Amazon cart, Amazon list. I'm like, definitely always always looking for something, to read. So thank you for that.
Of course.
What help you stay inspired while writing We Are Haunting? Because I know, like you said, you do music. Was music a big part of like your inspiration when writing We Are Haunting?
Mhm. That's a great question, especially like as I'm kind of working on like my second novel
Mhm.
and
Wow.
like writing and in those early stages and trying to find inspiration or maintain that
Yeah.
inspiration.
Right.
Um, that's a good question because thinking back on it,
Mhm.
um, I think it was and like hopefully
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
reach I reach this hunger again, right? But like it's kind of like like a musician
Mhm.
who works on their first like mixtape
Mhm.
or album or something, right? And
Right.
people claim like you could hear all like a life's work of
Mhm.
hunger and
Mhm.
stories and pain and that first, because you are kind of waiting your whole life to
Right.
write this thing or make this thing.
Right.
um so I think at the time I was just inspired by the people I was telling the story for.
Mhm. Mhm.
um I was watching this this IG reel of
Uh-huh.
another author, Jamila Minix,
Mhm.
and she was talking about essentially like she has an audience she writes for, and then she has people she writes for, right?
Mm.
Or
Mhm.
thinking about like who you're writing for versus audience, and
Mhm.
versus who's gonna eventually even pick up your book, right?
Right. Right.
Um, and I think those are different levels.
Right.
Um, so in me, I think like what kept me going, what kept me inspired was thinking about who I was writing the story for. And it
Right.
was my mom, it was my
Mhm.
grandmother, it was my dad, it was my brother, it
Mhm.
was my childhood friends, it
Mhm.
was my my neighborhood
Right.
community center. It's my
Mhm.
second grade art teacher. You know, like
Right.
it's a it's a community, right? That or or like writing as this process, but keeping um these faces in my mind, right? Or these opinions, or imagining reading this line to this person, right?
Right.
And what would their reaction be?
Right.
Um, and I think that um, that grounded me a lot, um,
Right.
but also lit a fire under me because
Mhm.
I was aware of like my the work what didn't seem in vain, right?
Right.
It was like this has to work. This has to
Mhm.
you know this has to be what it is. But even if it doesn't, right?
Mhm.
I'll still have this thing that I get to share, or
Mhm.
I'll still have this thing that I can give to my mom,
Right.
and she can
Right.
read,
Right.
and like we can have this conversation, like
Mhm.
you know,
Exactly.
yeah,
That's true. Yeah. And like you said, when it comes to writing, like they asked me, like, so who are you writing for? I was like, well, I'm writing for people who like romance, like in my sense, who like romance, who want to be romance, who want to read about black love,
right,
who are
right,
interested in black love. So,
right,
even if my mama just read it, that's fine. Even if a few friends just
right,
read it, like, and things like that.
right, mm-hmm,
Really just doing it for myself, So
mm-hmm,
I think telling stories that I would like to hear. So,
yeah, yeah,
yeah, yeah.
that's important too.
Right, very. What's your favorite thing about Juneteenth?
Ooh,
Mm-hmm.
the cookouts.
Okay.
Mm.
Yeah.
Man, I I'm at my apartment in Mississippi right now, but I've been having like deep withdrawals of like spending a Juneteenth in Prospect Park in Brooklyn, like
Mm,
in
okay. Uh-huh.
unparalleled, like
Right.
the
Mhm,
cookouts,
mhm.
the music,
Right.
the shea butter,
Mhm.
just much, just
Uh-huh.
so much
Right.
picture, this
Uh,
um and like this stuff
mhm.
down here and stuff like
Right.
that. I'm
Right.
sure there's a bunch of stuff in Georgia, I'm sure.
Right. Yeah.
I have to be more like
Mhm. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
active in finding these things, but yeah, sometimes I'll just get homesick randomly.
Right. Yeah.
You'll I'll be in the oh, I'm in Juneteenth in
Mhm.
Brooklyn and like
Right.
or at somebody's block party or something like that. So,
Right.
so all of
Yeah.
those things kind of of course, like, don't mean what Juneteenth mean, but, like, that same
Right. Yeah.
that same level of,
Right.
coming together and gathering and, like, being in the space and being in the presence of other, like, Black folks
Right. Exactly.
always, you know
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's just rejuvenating.
Yeah, the fellowship is always beautiful,
Right,
just
fellowship.
among so I think that's cool too. Well, Tyreek, I thank you for joining me. Thank you guys for listening, and make sure you guys pick up a copy of We Are a Haunting. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.
Thank you so much.